terrible distortions of Western politics and religiosity have taken place because of drugs. For example, and this is to me one of the most shocking examples imaginable, slavery died with the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome had a system of labor called the latifundia, which was essentially a slave work crew, and that institution died with the fall of Rome. During the medieval period, if you were into slavery, it meant you had one slave, and this slave was extremely well looked after and cared for because they were a symbol of munificent opulence on your part, that you could afford such a luxury. It was like having a Maserati to have a slave. Well, then around 1400, before the discovery of America, in the eastern Atlantic islands of Madeira, they began experimenting with the growing of cane sugar. And it was fine, except that the sugar has to be boiled at 130 degrees, and no one would work around that. They discovered that they had to chain people to the cooking apparatus for the extraction of sugar. And they began bringing Africans to do this. And they not only reinvented slavery for the deliberate production of sugar, which was utterly unnecessary to the diet of Europe. I mean, there hadn't been a ton of sugar imported into Europe in the previous 1,000 years. And suddenly they felt this tremendous need for sugar, and they reinstitutionalized slavery with the added insult that for the first time, a particular race was singled out as being somehow made for slavery. And this is the beginning of black xenophobia on the part of Europeans, the association with the sugar trade. By 1800, every pound of sugar being imported into England was being produced by slave labor, and slavery was going at a rate that had not been seen since the Rome of Caligula, all in the name of commerce, all in the name of having this essentially trivial kick from sugar. So it's really important to educate ourselves as to what constitutes a drug and how drugs are legislated against and suppressed or promoted and advertised entirely according to whether they fit into the agenda of the reigning model of culture, whatever that may be.
Consider this. Wikipedia politely calls globalism internationalism. From Kissinger to Rockefeller to Soros, every proponent of globalism has been a rich white guy. No one calls these people white internationalists. Globalists are white internationalists, quote unquote. It's so true. In 1993, after the first attack on the World Trade Center, the Coffee, Sugar, and Cocoa Exchange, which was headquartered there, prepared a secondary base in case of emergency. This emergency location continued to be maintained after the Coffee, Sugar, and Cocoa Exchange merged with the New York Cotton Exchange to become the New York Board of Trade. The emergency base, the upkeep for which cost the board $350,000 annually, enabled the world's coffee, sugar, cocoa, and cotton trades to continue without a hitch after the board's World Trade Center headquarters was destroyed on September 11, 2001. When I paid $8,000 to visit the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, I went to the mosque in which the Prophet Muhammad is buried, paid my respects, and then stepped outside and went to Starbucks. Dunkin' Donuts has positioned its own shitty coffee as the red state elixir of blue-collar working heroes. America runs on Dunkin'. Coffee as patriotism. This is the America that began its revolt against colonial rule by dumping British tea into Boston Harbor. In 1638, coffee reached Venice. Prior to coffee's introduction to Europe, white empires had laid the foundation for an economic system in which coffee would contribute to slavery and gross inequality for centuries to come. I pick up the glass cylinder and pour sugar into my coffee. Malcolm X used to say that coffee was the only thing that he liked to see integrated, but the sweetening of coffee with milk and sugar was a European invention. Sugar, tea, and coffee also found a place as the preferred soft drugs of Western Europe. They projected an image of bourgeois standing, a function completely different from those performed by indigenous European psychoactive substances. It was through the early expansion of Islam that sugar reached the Mediterranean, and through the Crusades that Western Europeans first encountered sugar. The first cane cuttings arrived in the New World with Christopher Columbus, who took them from his father-in-law's plantation in Madeira to a Spanish settlement in the Caribbean in 1493. As Christians brought sugar to the New World in turn exposed them to tobacco. Quote, despite the fact that both plants originated among heathen peoples, sugar was never frowned upon by the church and was considered veritable ambrosia. According to Ortiz, both sugar and tobacco were racialized, informed by who grew them and who used them. Tobacco, he writes, was an inheritance received from the Indian. The Africans learned the cultivation and pleasure of tobacco from the natives, and also grew tobacco to sell until whites realized its commercial potential and banned Africans from growing tobacco except for personal use. The white men then brought tobacco back to the Old World, in turn introducing it to the Muslims. Upon its arrival, tobacco was temporarily outlawed and its use punished with death in the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Portuguese missionaries and traders would also bring tobacco to India, China, Indonesia, and Japan. Within a relatively short period, both sugar and tobacco became globally recognized and accepted. The Portuguese, who had successfully cultivated sugar in West Africa, produced sugar in their American colonies, and the high price of sugar led to French, British, and Spanish territories in the Caribbean, eventually becoming sugar plantation societies, with sugar driving their entire economies. Producing crude sugar required a significant workforce, and making a profit from mass sugar production required the labor to come cheap. The Portuguese and other powers would solve this problem by replacing the dead natives with living Africans. Columbus sent some captured natives to his friend in Seville in 1494. The next year saw 400 natives put on the eastward boats as slaves. The trade switched directions as Africans came to be regarded as better workers and better suited to the climate of the Americas than American natives were to the cold of Europe. Growing demands for production in the New World required a steady flow of human cargo across the Atlantic, since slaves didn't live long, and it was cheaper to replace adults with adults than to wait for slave babies to grow. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to trade slaves on a massive scale, beginning with the importation of black Africans for what we would today call indentured servitude. This led to significant intermarriage, and most Portuguese today carry some genetic connection to 15th century Congo. With the development of high production agriculture and an increasing need for slaves, the 15th century saw a change in how slave was defined. Enslavement became a permanent status, not only lifelong but also hereditary. It outlived the slaves and survived in their children. In the coming centuries, this system would become rational and scientific. The Portuguese were advantaged in that it was a relatively short trip from their trading posts in West Africa to Brazil, so slaves survived the voyage at a higher rate than those shipped to the Caribbean. A little more than 3% of the average ship's cargo consisted of children under 10 years old. Such children were inventoried and sold along with their mothers. The success of European sugar slavery would establish a working template and infrastructure for coffee slavery. Mercantile empires of the Old World exploited their New World colonies and African slaves to produce these commodities. Most chocolate ultimately came from Venezuela. Most tobacco came from the slave plantations in Virginia. Portugal produced its coffee in Brazil, Spain took its coffee from Mexico, Cuba, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Venezuela, and the British produced theirs in Jamaica. The demand for drugs moved history. Haiti, France's primary source of sugar, chocolate, and coffee, replenished its labor force every week with a new shipment of slaves. For the traffickers and bodies, slaves themselves could be traded for drugs. In 18th century New England, an adult slave was worth 130 gallons of rum, a child 80 gallons. The notorious triangle trade consisted of seafaring merchants exchanging American rum for African slaves. Molasses was then distilled to make the rum that in turn would be traded for more slaves, who would make more sugar to make more rum to get more slaves. Traders in Newport were said to have obtained a total of over 106,000 slaves through the rum exchange. Many of the migrant workers in Britain's Caribbean sugar plantations came from British India. They brought cannabis with them, which would come to be known in British Jamaica by the Sanskrit-derived term ganja. The herb was found to be a serious problem for the imperial economy, since it turned the Indian immigrants into lousy workers. Getting high seems to have left colonial subjects uninterested in properly submitting to their masters. In a colony in which there were nearly as many natives as Europeans, and Africans outnumbered the Europeans 10 to 1, ganja became a political threat. Cannabis was not indigenous to the Americas, but the low THC strain hemp had first reached the New World with the conquistadors in 1545 for the non-psychoactive purpose of making rope. The use of hemp in manufacturing spread to other European powers, and the first cannabis law in U.S. history, established in Jamestown in 1619, actually required farmers to grow hemp. The real magic of ingesting high THC cannabis, however, remained largely unknown in the West. Yeah, because they didn't want you to feel the world soul. As ganja circulated among the colonial subjects, passing from the South Asian laborers to the African cane cutters, folk medicine and spirituality also took hold in local culture, along with traditions of dreadlocks, vegetarianism, and perhaps the notion of avatars. Read it all through the lens of the Bible, and you get Rastafari. I don't know much about Rastafari. For the colonial oppressors to outlaw ganja only added to its sacramental authority. In Europe, coffee and tea triumphed over marijuana because they were presented as signifiers of high class and sophistication, arriving at a time when Europeans viewed the refined Chinese tea ritual with envy. Ha! Yeah, I bet. And additionally because these soft drugs were seen as a dignified alternative to wine. Caffeine also fit well into the period in which Enlightenment philosophy and modern capitalism took shape, as both depended on a scientific rationalism that required sharp and clear minds. The sober institution of the coffee house became more desirable than rowdy taverns for the exchange of ideas or business negotiations. Cannabis loses again. Weed's the perfect sacrament for Rastafari visions of Zion and Babylon. And the 5%ers are right in calling it quote-unquote equality. Weed always seems to be the drug on the bottom, the drug of poor righteous teachers opposed at every step by social inequality. Weed slows the labor machine down and coffee speeds it up, which is why only caffeine, the drug that in 1903 replaced cocaine as a stimulant in Coca-Cola, could become the official drug of capitalism. Like what we have today, okay, it's better than communism, sure, but it's in its death throes. Caffeine's also the official drug of my getting through grad school. Ah, great. Germany brought coffee to what is now Rwanda in 1905 and enacted a policy that gave military support to local elites, called Tutsis, in exchange for access to the manpower of the common masses, who were called Hutus. The common masses were the Hutus. Remember this. Colonial law empowered tribal chiefs to force their subjects to produce coffee. German, and later Belgian administrators, structured Rwandan society on a myth of biological difference in which Tutsis and Hutus were not merely social classes, but in fact markedly separate ethnicities, with the Tutsis superior to the Negroid Hutus. Ethnic identity cards were issued to ensure that Hutus were not able to obtain the education or work reserved for Tutsis. That's horrifying. These fabricated differences, after enough time, became so real that the Tutsis and Hutus saw themselves as genuinely distinct ethnicities. Nearly a century after coffee and white people entered the life of Rwanda, white internationalists, creating and enforcing false divisions between human beings and valuing the production of coffee for European powers over that of food for local people, bing, 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 Hutus and Tutsis ended up slaughtering each other in 100 days of massive genocide. Reducing the Rwandan civil war to a quote-unquote tribal conflict, American media, because they've never done anything wrong, ensured that the naked brutality fed to our eyes with images of skulls stacked into pyramids, black men wielding machetes, dismembered children, and rivers running red with blood would be seen as inescapably primitive, driven by something that the modern, rational West could never comprehend. The end of colonialism did not mean an end to coffee's body count. Coffee is still produced by poor nations for the enjoyment of rich nations, and the work of empire is now performed mostly by corporations. When the producing nations attempt to balance this inequality, they commonly meet resistance from the consuming nations. In 2006, the government of Ethiopia sought to trademark its Sidamo, Harar, and Yigur Shefi beans, meaning that distributors across the globe would have to pay a licensing fee to use these premium crops. The idea was that trademarks would bring a larger share of specialty coffee prices to the people who actually made the specialty coffee. The nearly 2 million farmers in a country that a United Nations report ranked 7th from the bottom in terms of development, where a quarter of the people lived on less than $1 a day. In Ethiopia's bid for a fairer share, the chief opposition came from Starbucks, which raced ahead of the government to trademark Sidamo. Starbucks claimed Ethiopia's most valuable natural resource as its own intellectual property. It was colonialism without flags. After a legal struggle between one of the world's poorest nations and one of the world's most recognizable corporations became a public relations disaster for the latter, Starbucks agreed to sign a licensing agreement with Ethiopia. The company that sold its Harar coffee for $26 a pound reluctantly committed to no longer block the flow of money to farmers in Harar who made up to $1.10 a pound. Suddenly, the question of how I'd feel about someone crashing a plane head-on into all that slavery, suffering, and death is worth asking. John went to college in Ohio. In his 20s, he started a supply business 2 years prior to the Civil War. Instead of fighting for the Union, he was poised to sell them groceries and oil. In his very first year, Rockefeller turned a $4,000 investment into $450,000. By fate, the federal government began subsidizing the price of oil as much as 3,000%. All of the profits flowed directly into Rockefeller's pockets. By 1863, the talons of the Standard Oil Company, America's first monopoly, had clenched 90% of the market. In 1911, it was ceremonially split by antitrust laws, forming the Seven Sisters of Oil that we know today. This government-enforced breakup was instrumental in making John D. Rockefeller, Sr., the richest, most powerful man in America. April 20th, 1914. In Ludlow, Colorado, 1,000 coal miners stopped coming to work for Mr. Rockefeller. They had been forced out of their homes and living in a makeshift camp while on strike. 66 miners, wives, and children were gunned down and burned alive on the camp's property. The guards and the state militia were hired and supplied by Rockefeller. No one, including Rockefeller, stood trial for this mass murder.